Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study here at the New Covenant House. We are studying Christian Anarchism by Alexander Christianopoulos. We've been doing that for quite a while now, actually, and we are up to chapter 6, which deals with examples of real-life Christian anarchist examples. Last time we looked at the early church, and I think all the anarchist writers agree that that is a perfect example of a Christian anarchist society that they were building there, until Constantine came around and kind of ruined it in some sort of way. He saw that persecution did not make the Christians go away, so he kind of joined them and immediately began to corrupt them. And he was pretty successful at that. So in the next almost 1,000 years or so, none of the Christian anarchist writers give us any examples of movements in the church that qualify as Christian anarchists. Until we get to the 11th and 12th centuries. However, at this point in time, there was nothing called anarchism. So at that point, nobody really knew what that was, and nobody had actually articulated what that is. So the examples that are coming here are sort of deficient in some ways. They cannot all be characterized as fully anarchist, but they have elements, and that's what we're talking about here. That's what the anarchist writers are pointing out, that already in the 11th and 12th century there were movements that had the characteristics of the Christian anarchism that they are further developing in next week when we go into that part of the book that talks about modern day Christian anarchist movements. And the people they're talking about here, first of all, they talk about the Waldenses, which was a movement that started in France, I believe. And he also mentioned the Albigenses. I'm not sure where they are and what they stand for, but they're, I think, similar to the Waldenses, but maybe from a different area. The characteristics about the Waldenses is that they refused to take oaths, and they condemned war and death penalty. What they also did was and I read that from a different place, that they also wanted people to be able to read the Bible directly. There should be no middlemen, no priests to interpret the Bible for them, which is exactly what Tyndale and Wycliffe in England were advocating. They were translating the Bibles to modern day, to the English at the time, so people could understand what the Bible was about, and not relying on priests, because the church has already by then become extremely corrupt. Let's go into that a little bit, perhaps. So after Rome fell in 476 AD, when some barbarian tribes overwhelmed them and put an end to the Roman Empire. Europe at that time was kind of divided up in a bunch of little principalities. There was no real there was no real power in the secular world that could kind of take over until Charlemagne appeared in, I don't know, in around the 800s or so. And he began to create a kind of secular power of some significance in Europe. What happened is that, and parallel to that, the church kind of had this sort of worldwide reach at that time. The world at that time was a lot smaller. Nobody really counted anything outside of the Mediterranean, North Africa, Mediterranean, Europe, anything in the East, Africa, North America. North America wasn't even discovered at that point, South America neither. So, but somehow Charlemagne and the church kind of got into some kind of alliance that kind of like propped each other up, so that they both had enormous power for a while there, and it kind of culminated into the as a matter of fact, we mentioned Harold Bluetooth a couple of times. So Harold Bluetooth saw that the powers in Europe were increasing, and there was just no way that he could resist them if they decided to invade Denmark, Norway. So because the principalities in Germany was aligned with the church and sort of had their blessing or power from the church, he decided that Denmark, Norway had to become Christian, so that he kind of became brothers with them, so they couldn't really attack them anymore. So that kind of like was a way to keep the peace and still remain in power. And then shortly after that followed the Crusades, which was another really interesting thing, because it was really about religion, keeping the Muslims out. But the church used the power of the state, the armies, to do it. So there was again this sort of alliance between them, but it was kind of also a struggle, a power struggle between them, because sometimes kings and princes would align themselves with either one or the other, or maybe with the nobility, to keep power for themselves. So they would either get support from the church, or they would get support from the nobility, the landed nobility in the country. So yeah, that was interesting. But anyway, so this alliance between them, Chelciki is the guy who writes about that. He wrote a book called Net of Faith, and the picture that he is using it's a net, like the disciples became fishers of men, so they've caught a bunch of fish in this net, but there were two large whales in the net, and the two whales in the net pictures on the state and the church. So these large animals now thrashed around in there and made a lot of noise and really ripped the nets apart, so all the fish escaped. So that was the picture that Chelciki is using, but that's pretty much illustrates a lot how Europe was at the time in the 1500s or so. I think Chelciki was born late in the 1300s and died in the 1400s, so something like that. I think we'll hear more about him when we get to the conclusion in the book in a few weeks. But he's a very he never really identified as an anarchist because that term wasn't even invented at that time yet. But the anarchist writers point to him as having elements from anarchism because he was the first one to identify this tension between the state and the church. The anarchist writers aren't really happy about either one of them anyway. Another example that they are coming to is, oh wait, yeah. You just mentioned perhaps that Helsinki also distinguished himself by their strict pacifism and tried to live in line with the principles described in chapter 5. So that's pacifism is still very important for all of these groups. Another one that's mentioned here is Francis of Assisi, because there were some other monastic movements at the time. I'm not really sure exactly when Francis of Assisi came on the scene, but he is recognized as having at least some elements of anarchism in his ideas there. They seems to be during the time of the Crusades. But his organization wasn't really durable because it became institutionalized and actually became swallowed up by the Catholic Church. And he himself got discouraged and withdrew from it in the end. So, yeah. And then he mentions here there are some organizations or some movements in England that have this characteristics of what he calls embryonic Christian anarchism. So the beginnings, but not the full thing. And he mentioned the peasants' revolt, the ranters, the diggers, and the levelers. I'm not sure what any of these are, but that's what he said. They have Christian anarchist inclinations. He also mentions the Quakers in the 17th century, and they are actually still around today. Not many of the others are, but he is. But they are. And one of their main things, again, is pacifism. And their refusal to serve in armies. And then later on, actually, they came before. The Anabaptist movements became, I'm not really sure exactly when it started, but maybe in the 1600s or so. And the writers who are identifying that as one of the more solid anarchists are Eller, Yoder, and Penner. And another guy, Bartley. They all recognize Anabaptists as having many characteristics of anarchism. And again, it's the nonviolence that's important for them. They don't swear oaths. It highlights the importance of presenting the world a community of Christian love and sacrifice inspired by the witness of the early Christian church. And the more important thing about them is that they do not believe in infant baptism. So faith cannot be coerced. It has to be voluntary. So that's the main thing about Anabaptism. They have believers' baptism. So anybody who joins does so on their own, um, through their own will. And they also advocate total separation of the church and state. Kropotkin is a more modern day writer. He's not a Christian. Maybe he is, actually. Some of these, there are actually three important anarchist writers: Kropotkin, Bakunin, and Proudhon. I'm not sure if they all identify as Christians, but they are the ones we recognize as the ones who defined anarchism more than anybody else. And we also count Tolstoy as an anarchist, but he was kind of reluctant. He didn't really want to do that, to identify as that, but he was. But Kropotkin says that Anabaptists, that there's a lot of anarchism in Anabaptism. That's a quote from one of his books, apparently. So again, these things that the writers identify about these groups is that they are not fully developed anarchist thoughts. They have some of the elements from it, but not all of them. And the important things that they say is the separation of the church, and but they're not fully developed as an argument that grounded clear and explicit anarchist conclusions, say criticism specifically directed at the state or the longing for especially stateless society, they say. So, yeah, it's anarchism, but not fully developed. And what that also happens is that they rarely carried the momentum to a full articulation and presentation of Christian anarchism in all its implications. Some of them ended up going on compromises with the state and the church. So, and you could call them failures, but you could say they didn't really fully implement. They weren't really all in, and so they're kind of imperfect in some ways. He says Christianopoulos. But they do qualify as historical examples of Christian anarchism, so they are important for us to know about. Okay, so that's enough about the movements about the Reformation. Next week, I think we'll finish this chapter and look at some modern day examples there, and these all qualify as Christian anarchist movements because they have been identified by writers who identify as such, or they identify as such themselves. So yeah, we're going to do that next time and then finish this chapter, and then we'll go into a conclusion for the final stretch of studies in this book. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.